If you would take out your message outline for today, we are doing a series called Grace and Truth. And truthfully, I'm going to be glad when this is over because this has been the hardest series I have ever done. It started on Easter, and next week, Lord willing, will be the last one in this series. And today we're going to talk about economics. And this is one of the reasons why I really don't like this series is I'm going to attempt to do a 30-minute message on the subject of economics, which seems absurd. But I am encouraged by that you all will get something out of that, more like a big talking point or a story that will help as you deal with our current culture's confusion, tremendous confusion about economics. A number of years ago, there was a woman who wrote a story for Vox, and she was a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And she wrote an article, said her movement's goals were to, quote, end capitalism and radically change America. You ever heard that language before from some of our previous politicians? To end capitalism and radically change America. Her name was Megan Day. She was a member of the East Bay chapter up in the Oakland area of the Democratic Socialists of America. And I'm quoting from the article. In the long run, democratic socialists want to end capitalism. She wrote that the liberal big government reforms, which were going on at the time, which the movement has chosen to rally behind in partnership with the Democratic Party, are simply stepping stones to that eventual goal. In other words, bigger government will help us get toward the world of overcoming capitalism and the wonderful world of socialism, as she put. And again, quoting from her, social democratic reforms like Medicare for all, in the eyes of the democratic socialists, are part of the long, uneven process of building that support and eventually overthrowing capitalism. Now, there were some in the mainstream media that heard that and tried to do what the mainstream media was so good at doing, and that is sort of provide cover for her. And she came back and she said, no, that's exactly what we believe and what we're here for. Now, her goal is not really the first time this has happened. Now, when King Solomon followed King David, and Solomon died, then Rehoboam, his son, was the next in line to be the king. And Solomon, when he was a young man, had a lot of wisdom about him. But as time went on, he got into that midlife crisis kind of thing that you see so often around us. And over the course of his life, he married a couple of what were called foreign women. And 1 Kings 11:4 and verse 6 tells us that they turned his hearts away from God. And what happened was the midlife crisis was now on steroids. If you read the first several chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes, you'll find that he tried all kinds of things to fill that missing it that we were chasing in college. He tried a harem, marriage, concubines. He tried big building projects and gardens. He tried horses, stables. He tried armies, growing his army, and he tried the acquisition of property and land. Now, that all came at a cost. And the cost was, for the people, was greater taxation and forced labor. Think about that second one. Forced labor. And so when Solomon died, the question that the leaders in the assembly had was, what's Rehoboam going to do? And in 1 Kings 12:3, we have the whole assembly went to Rehoboam and said to him, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. So what they're asking for is, can you do something about this government, what we would call government overreach, all these pet projects, all these things that Solomon was choosing to go after at the cost of forced labor and extra taxation. Please remove this yoke from us. So Rehoboam went to two groups of advisors. He went to the old guys, and the old guys said to him, they've got a point. You have got to cut back on this or you're going to lose the country. And he went to a bunch of young guys, and they all would have been great bureaucrats today. No, the answer is more government and more forced labor and greater taxes. And verse 10 picks up the story. The young men who'd grown up with him replied, these people have told you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than your father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Now, what we have here is an illustration of the intoxicating aroma of government power, where no matter how big it gets, it always wants more. And I suspect that many of our government leaders, even some of them who go to Washington or Sacramento with good intentions, it's very easy to get caught up in this validation of the power that you have. Now, after he told the people this, the 12 tribes of Israel became the 2 tribes of Judah, because the 10 northern tribes said, you are crazy, and they left, and the nation split from 10 tribes in the north to 2 tribes in the south, never to be reunited again. Rehoboam and Solomon had an amazing ability to run an economy into the ground, as several of our presidents, both currently and in the past, in my years as an adult, I've witnessed. One of the things that is out in the world now, particularly on the university campus, is what's called crony capitalism. And this is the excuse that many college students talk about why they're against capitalism and they're for socialism. Crony capitalism. And the idea is, with crony capitalism, is that the system is rigged by those who make the money and it's unfair to everybody else. Now, this particular method or way of thinking appeals to a young person's idealism and their utopianism and a legitimate desire for things to be fair. I get that. But as we looked at last week, and the last 2 weeks regarding government, is there's one thing that is impossible to get around, and that is that all of us have this corrupt gene inside of us. And that affects how we live and the government policies that are made. And yes, there is something called crony capitalism, but I think there are a couple things that are worse than crony capitalism: crony socialism and crony communism. The crony part is impossible to get around in this world because of that corrupt gene that lies within us. The big target on the university campus, the big evil, is profit. Profit, because profit is automatically associated with greed and materialism as an evil. And yet the Bible describes profit as a good thing. Proverbs 14:23 says, all hard work brings a profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. There are many verses in the book of Proverbs that talk about the importance of diligence and that diligence has a good effect. And one of those good effects is profit has a good effect of helping people. Proverbs 21:5, the plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. One of the things that's easy to lose sight of is that capitalism and profit has been the incentive for some of our greatest inventions. Now, I don't own an electric car, and so far I don't really wish to own one. Part of the reason is the price. But we have electric cars now all over America because somebody and several different companies figured out a way to make electric cars and to make a profit by it. We have airplanes now because years and years ago, people invented airplanes for the purpose of being able to travel all around the world. And because those companies that build airplanes like Boeing and those that fly airplanes make a profit, you and I get to get on planes and fly somewhere halfway across the country in 2.5 hours instead of driving for about 24 hours. Profit helped in that particular thing. We have, if you go to Ralph's, which I go to about once a week, Ralph's is filled with products on every aisle. And the reason they are, each of those products makes a profit. If any one of those products did not make a profit, it would not be on a Ralph's shelf. In other words, no matter what aisle you go up to, you're going to find not just products that you want, but also you're going to find lots of different kinds of the same product at different kinds of prices. Each of those will make a profit. And that profit is not just good for Ralph's. That profit is good for the farmers if they grew the food, or ranchers if they grew livestock. The people that drive trucks have to make a profit. And they benefit when you and I go to Ralph's and buy something that they hauled on to that store. The people that unbox those things at Ralph's and stock them themselves, and one of our own, Michelle, who works at Ralph's, is a checker. And because Ralph's makes a profit on what they sell, she has a job. And we're happy about that. All those people have a job because of profit. If a business does not make a profit, it's not going to be in business for very long. And you're not going to have a job, and you're going to be updating your resume fairly often if you join a company that's not making a profit. Capitalism is driven by finding a need and meeting it. It's a little more complicated than that. You need to find a need and meet that need for a price that other people are willing to pay for that. Those three things are what drives capitalism. In other words, it's the things that you and I want or need as consumers that gives incentive to people who make things or grow things in order to make a profit where they have a job and others have a job, and we are willing to pay for those things. Well, what is socialism? Well, socialism, again, is all the rage as we look at on the college campus particularly. And the last survey I saw, Gallup survey, said that there are more Democratic voters who are for socialism now than capitalism in our country, which is a rather staggering thing to think about. Well, socialism appeals to our idealism and our utopianism, and socialism, just like on the college campus, is sort of a knee-jerk reaction to what crony capitalism is. Well, what is socialism? Socialism is the pursuit of an economic system defined by three things: government planning, government direction, and government control. Now, the story of Rehoboam that we looked at earlier is an example of that. The story in your handout in 1 Samuel 8, 10 through 19 is another example of that, but we're not going to look at that this morning. But the idea of socialism is basically this: the experts know better how to plan an economy than the business people or the consumers. They know how to plan, they know how to produce, they can get the job done in a way that's better than just free enterprise or the market. Now, when I hear about a planned economy, what's assumed is that anything else is an unplanned economy. Well, you and I plan our economy if you have any sense about you. You sit down with your budget and you plan out, what are we going to buy, what can we spend, what can we afford, how much can we save. You are planning in the realm of economy. When I make a grocery list to go to Ralph's, I am planning my economy. When I go to Ralph's, the folks at Ralph's have already planned their economy. And they know what things they're going to have on those shelves and what things they're not going to have on their shelves. And the businesses that make those things are planning their economy, and they're going to make sure their products get on those shelves at Ralph's. Now, the question I have is, who does a better job of planning? The bureaucrats in Sacramento or Washington, D.C., or in Moscow, or in Berlin 80 years ago, or some of the other places in Eastern Europe that tried this before? Or you and me and people that are running a business? A number of years ago, I remember listening to this was an astounding interview. It was on the radio, and it was a fellow that was a local Southern California newscaster was interviewing. I think he was the vice president of development for Carl's Jr. / Hardee's. Hardee's back in the South, Carl's Jr. out here. And the fellow asked this president of development, how many stores is Carl Jr. and Hardee's going to open next year in America? He said 200. Wow. Well, how many of them are going to be open in California? And the fellow said 0, none. Now, the fellow who was doing the interview was shocked by this. And I remember thinking at the time, 1 in 7 Americans lives in California. If you're going to open up 200 stores across America, you might think there might be 30 or so open in California. And the guy was really taken back by this, and he said, why aren't you going to open any stores in California where there's so much population? He said there are 3 reasons. First is, it costs us $50,000 more per store to build it here in California than it does in Texas. And the reason for that mostly is red tape and regulations. $50,000 right out the door. The second reason is it takes us about 6 months longer to build a store in California than it does in Texas. That's 6 months without income, with the property sitting there, and we're having to pay rent or all the different things that go along with it. And the third reason, he said, is the laws of employees out here, employer laws, require us in California to have, every employee has to have a 1-hour lunch break after 4 hours of working, and they have to have every 2 hours, they have to have a 15-minute break. Now you say, well, what's wrong with that? That's reasonable. But they automated this to where all the different stores, the employees had to clock in and clock out for their coffee break and their lunch break. And if they were working during their coffee break or their lunch break, that particular store got fined. So the guy was telling the newscaster, said, what's happened is we have stores all over California where the heaviest traffic is around lunch hour, where people are trying to get their lunch on a short amount of time. And we have employees sitting back out of sight who are on their lunch break or their coffee break while there's a line of people waiting. We just better to open stores in Texas. Sometimes government can make this so hard for people who are trying to make a living or run a business that it's just absurd. Absurd. And this is a great example of socialism. Well, what is communism? Isaiah 10:1 says, woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees. It's really astounding to me. I was a history major, but it's astounding to me how many people do not know the history of communism. When I grew up, I watched the Soviet Union gobble up most of Eastern Europe and the different Soviet nations around them, Belarus and Ukraine, etc., and perform their wonder of communism on those people. Maybe you're old enough to remember when the Berlin Wall finally came down in 1989, and the joy of the East Berliners to leave that horrid, sucky financial place and make it to West Berlin and to freedom and to capitalism. I had some good friends of mine that were missionaries when Glasnost and Perestroika hit, where the Soviet Union opened up. John and Diane Wooster, I think a few of you have met them. And they immediately felt the call to go to Moscow to train church planters. I think this was like 1989. They had at the time 2 sets of twin boys. I think the older sons were not quite 4, and the younger sons were not quite 1. Diane Wooster, she's an amazing lady. They moved to Moscow, and they lived on the 16th floor of a high-rise, and they never knew in winter if they were going to have heat. And they never knew in summer if they were going to have air conditioning. And they never knew if the elevators were going to work. And every day, Diane took those 4 kids with her shopping to the store. But this is not like going to Ralph's, where you have your list of things you're going to get. She went every day to the store just to buy whatever was on the shelf. Some days there might be corn on the cob. Some days there might be fish. Some days there might be candy or bread or some type of dairy. Every day. And there were long lines of people waiting at all the doors to go in just to buy whatever was possible. Welcome to the world of communism. One of the things that is not very well known about communism is that generally socialism almost always precedes communism. Oh, isn't that fun? But you never hear that from folks who claim to be socialists and socialists only. One of the things, I like to do a little history here. Let's go to the next slide, Lisa. That's it. Nope, you're good. So this is what looks like a stained glass window that you might find in a church. This is a stained glass window, but you won't find this in any church. On January 4th, 1884, a group banded together who were committed to socialism worldwide, particularly in England and the United States. And they called themselves the Fabian Society. And the reason they called themselves the Fabian Society was it was after a Roman general, Fabius Maximus, who was known for his stealth tactics. And they decided if they were going to change the world to socialism, they couldn't do a frontal assault or a revolution like what Marx was saying to do. They were going to have to be very smooth, almost like the screw tape letters that we're going to see next month, very covertly. Their symbol was a turtle, just little by little moving forward. And their motto at first was, make haste slowly. Make haste slowly. Their purpose was to overthrow the Christian doctrine of private property and ownership, as well as overturning the social order of family, finances, economy, education, politics, and sex. If you've been with us since Easter, then you are familiar with some of this in our own country. Think of this as stealth socialism. And in one of the things that is one of the most incredible, deceitful things I think I've ever heard in my life, they decided to cover over all of this socialism with Christian language and metaphors, like this stained glass window. And where it looks like you have people praying, and it looks like you have the holy books at the bottom. Let me walk through what this stained glass is. It's designed by George Bernard Shaw in 1910. Founding member was Edward Peace, who's the fellow on the left. And the metaphor here, he's got a bellows there, which he's blowing air on top over to the right there, where there's the globe. The globe, of course, is the earth. There's the anvil there. The metaphor is a blacksmith shop, where the fire is heating up the globe or melting the iron, where the blacksmith could then hammer the iron, the softened iron, into any shape he wanted to. And the two men are working with the hammer to reshape our world. And at the top it says, it's hard to see this, but remolding near to the heart's desire. They're going to change the world away from the dominion of God to the dominion of humanity. And instead of responsibility and relationships, they're going to move to the heart's desire, not just with economics, but with all of life. George Bernard Shaw is one of those guys with the hammer, and Edward Peace, the other, Sidney Webb is the other one. You can see a crest, which is right between the guys with the hammers, just above the globe. And there's a crest that it may be hard to see, but it's a wolf. You see the black head of a wolf. And the black head of the wolf is wearing lamb's wool. A black wolf in lamb's clothing. And on either side of the head, you'll see initials FS, which is the Fabian Society. This is their crest. And then the crest in the down here, the orange crest, is pray devoutly, hammer stoutly. Again, there's the mirage of Christianity to this, but the hammering is the important part. Down at the bottom, you have the 10 original members of the Fabian Society, and they all look like they're in prayer. But what they're actually praying to are their holy books, not the Bible, but the writings of the Fabian Society and of H.G. Wells and Edward Peace. And then over here on the left, H.G. Wells, it's hard to really see this, but in the old days, we would say if you're thumbing your nose at somebody, we'd go like this. Well, that's the imagery here, because that's the Judas in the group. As this went along, he said, this is crazy, and I'm out of there. And so they decided to include him in this group as Judas. What were they after? They justified three big things: the forcible redistribution of wealth, the erosion of personal freedom, which capitalism requires, and it justified violence toward getting what they wanted done. It was an incredible thing, and they were so, I hate to use the word clever because it sounds like a good idea, but when Sidney and his wife were buried or died, the other members had them buried at Westminster Abbey. Again, to give the illusion of the new Christianity that was coming. Well, what is capitalism? Well, capitalism it involves freedom is the great word. The freedom to make a profit, the freedom to invest your money, the freedom to earn your money, the freedom to spend your money how you would like to, the freedom to own a business or to start a business. Capitalism helps with incentive, to incentivize somebody to want to start. And in our particular country, opportunity has been the great also reason why people have flocked here and continue to flock here during our history. You get to decide what kind of product you're going to make and what kind you're going to buy. You get to decide what quality and what quantity you're going to make or what kind you're going to buy. You have the ability to own property, private property, and to make a profit and to invest your money. Now, in your handout, there are a bunch of verses here that describe sort of some of the dynamics of capitalism. And I'm not going to take the time to go through these. But the idea here, let me just read the first one, Proverbs 31:16. Proverbs 31 is the godly woman chapter. It's a great verse, a great chapter to read. She considers a field and buys it out of her earnings, i.e., profit. She plants a vineyard. She invests her money. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her task. She sees that her trading is, and here's the terrible word, profitable. Her trading is profitable, and her lamp does not go out at night. There are lots of things that the Bible talks about that go into capitalism that it espouses. Now, on the back side of your handout, there are also economic abuses, but the economic abuses that the Bible talks about are not just limited to capitalism. They're for any system of economics that you want to go after, and you can read those this afternoon if you'd like. Some of you are old enough to remember George McGovern. George McGovern is a fellow that ran for president several times. He was the Democratic nominee in 1972 against Richard Nixon, and he's most well known in that particular case as the largest landslide loser in our country's history. I think only Minnesota and D.C. Gave the electoral votes for him. He was a 3-term senator in South Dakota, served a number of terms in the House of Representatives. But finally, in 1984, he retired and he decided to go into business. And he and his wife decided to buy a cute little place up in Connecticut called the Stratford Inn. And this was going to be their great retirement and their business that they were going to do. Think of it as a bed and breakfast on steroids. Had 150 different rooms, cafeteria, room enough to host lots of business things and conferences, etc. And so he got into it with great gusto. They went through renovations, and they got it all set up. And 2 years later, they were bankrupt. Ask why? Well, he wrote an article that was published in the Wall Street Journal in 1992. It was called "A Politician's Dream is a Businessman's Nightmare." Now, this article should be required reading for everybody that on their first day of going into politics, or especially if you got elected into office. In fact, I have often thought that I wish the founders would have included that one of the qualifications to serve as a senator or representative is you have had to have some business experience. But I thought most of those guys did, so they wouldn't have thought of that. But this is the thing that he ran into in 2 years. He described the negative impact of government regulations and rulemaking on business. And this is what he says. Quote, the concept that most often eludes legislators is, can we make consumers pay the higher prices for the increased operating costs that accompany government regulations and government reporting requirements with reams of red tape, close quote. As a business owner, he suddenly worried over ever-increasing costs of health insurance, excessive litigation, outlandish litigation, and scapegoating. He came face to face with the reality in the private sector, quote, consumers do have a choice when faced with higher prices. How about that? Every such decision eventually results in job losses for somebody. And he goes on to say that he wished he'd had this experience before he got into government service as a senator or representative. Well, let's close in prayer. Father, our world is filled with so much foolishness and lies and things that sound like lies, sound like truth and sound so noble and like we ought to do this. And yet, as is so often true with human endeavors, what we miss is the corrupt nature with which we have to deal with ourselves and with other people. Instead of trying to build up our human ability and our humanness, and we can make it and we can do it right, this time it's going to be different. Perhaps we'd be better served, as we've looked at in this series, to simply humble ourselves to you and to align ourselves with the truth that we have in the Scripture. It's not just true about spiritual things, it's true about life. Economics and government and marriage and raising kids and business. All of life, we can find the truth in the Scripture. Father, in our country, where this is being debated on college campuses and driven in the news, on and on and on, help us as a country to lean back into the waves of utopianism, as if that's really possible. Help us to be wise and help us to have a voice. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.